Good afternoon and welcome to Research in Action brought to you by the Division of Research at Florida Atlantic University. Welcome to today's session. My name is Karen Scapinato. I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, due to the number of attendees we typically have, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box that you see in the bottom here. And just click on it and type the question. You can do that anytime during the presentation. We will go through the questions at the end of the presentation. With that, it is my great honor to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Morgan Cooley. Dr. Cooley earned her degrees at Florida State University. She has a Ph.D. in marriage and family therapy and a master's degree in social work, both from Florida State. She was a faculty member at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga before coming to Florida Atlantic University as a faculty member. Her interests are in foster children and foster parents, and particularly the mental health of foster children. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Cooley.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I am excited to give a little bit of a description of my research as well as other research on foster families. And before I do that, we'll go through a little bit of an overview of the foster care system as well. This presentation is entitled Foster Families 101, Balancing Chaos and Love. All right, so I'm going to start the presentation and talk just a little bit about me and my training. So maybe that will help you to understand how I come at the research. I'm going to talk a little bit about the foster care system and where my research fits. And then I'm going to start talking more about foster parenting and daily family life and end with some strategies for foster families to build resilience and love. One way that I've always thought about how I approach research is approaching things as both a researcher and a practitioner, but also adding in that policy lens as well. So my research interest is primarily in foster care and child welfare. However, my PhD is really gave me a background in family science, so it helps me to kind of understand more of the relationships between family members. I focused on foster parents, youth mental health, and a little bit on frontline child welfare workers. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second so you understand how that all fits together. My practice experiences have given me experience as an individual, couple, and family therapist. Part of that experience was doing therapy for families who are involved in the child welfare system. I also have experience in a neighborhood medical center working with vulnerable families, and private practice working with LGBT plus affirming families, or sorry, it's an LGBT affirming practice working with families and couples as well. I have some graduate internships and some professional work with the Florida Governor's Office of Adoption and Child Protection, the Florida Agency for Workforce Innovation, and I currently serve as the Family Policy Chair for the National Council on Family Relations. So you can see kind of hopefully how these pieces come together. Within this, I wanted to describe just some of the overarching goals of my research so that, like I said, to give you kind of an understanding of how all of this fits together, why research practice and policy is important to consider when you're thinking about working with families. So from the research end, I'm really interested in enhancing foster child well-being, especially through foster parent and family interactions. So how do we improve what goes on in the home? And also how do we improve interventions? From the practice side, that really means identifying and understanding key aspects of effective foster parent, caseworker, and stakeholder training, because even outside of what goes on in the foster home, there's a lot of things that influence how foster parents interact with children, how children interact with their foster parents, and their well-being overall. Within that, along with that, we hope to use this research to improve the context of child welfare practice with evidence-informed programs and policies. So I always say what happens at the family level or even the individual level sometimes is really important because policies have a great impact on family life and can really influence how foster children and how foster families interact. All right, so let's talk just a little bit about the foster care system. The foster care system is a smaller piece of the child welfare system. The child welfare system as a whole is there to protect child well-being as well as strengthen families. And with the foster care system, they are really focused on serving those who might need the most. And specifically, it's for children who are removed from the care of their biological families because of substantiated abuse or neglect, and the concern that they're not going to thrive within that home. So, and I'll go into a little bit more detail later. Within the US, there's about 437,000 children, a little bit more, who are currently in foster care. A little under half of those live with non-relative foster parents, so usually people who are less familiar or not familiar with the children at all, whereas about 32% live with relatives or people that the child might have known before. A smaller set live in residential or group care, and that's a little bit more outside of my current area of interest, but it is important to recognize that the majority of children do live with either non-relative or relative foster families. Within the small group of children, about half are reunified and about a quarter of those are adopted. And the goal of the child welfare system is to try to preserve families and to strengthen families. And so that reunification goal is really important. And I can talk a little bit more about that in a second. So one reason that we should really care about these outcomes and really think about these outcomes is because foster youth often do not have the same outcomes as those peers of theirs that are not in foster care. Throughout research from development, so understanding how children do in terms of health or mental well-being, in terms of their ability to engage in school. For example, if you have a youth in foster care, they've been removed from their home. They might be removed from their school district. They might be removed from their peers. They might be removed from their activities after school. And so that influences their school engagement. When children are put into foster care, they might experience disruptions to their educational attainment, their ability to complete assignments, their ability to stay focused, their ability to have consistent teachers or consistent environment. As far as their stable home and school environment, I kind of alluded to that. When you're changing caregivers, you're in a new place, you're in a new home, you might have new rules. And all of these things can influence how that youth transitions into adulthood. We found that if there's a smaller portion of youth, and we call those aging out, so youth who are not adopted or not reunified. But we find that those youth who stay in foster care, who do not have adoption or reunification specifically, face even higher risks to their well-being, such as criminal involvement, such as lower employment, such as higher pregnancy rates as compared to those who are not in foster care. So it's really important to think about how youth are doing and what ways we can support creating a more stable home environment for youth to keep them most safe, most stable, and also most healthy. So I wanted to, I'm going to throw out a little bit of theory, but I promise I'll keep it simple. And I really want to emphasize that it's important to think about foster parents and youth as a part of a very large system. And it's also important to think about that what happens in the home is not just about the foster parent and youth, but there's other pieces to consider as well. And so I'm going to focus on foster parents and foster youth for the rest of the presentation, but I wanted to kind of give you this idea of complexity, but also a little bit of the chaos that sometimes comes in when you're really trying to understand what foster family is. So I talked a little bit about my research being around foster parents and youth. And so that's a really important part of the system. But if you can imagine with foster families, youth came out of their biological parent or family home when they came into foster care, and they have relationships with their biological parents and family. You also have a caseworker who's working with the case, who's monitoring, who's checking in, who's reporting back to the child welfare system on how that youth is doing, how the family's doing. In some cases, you have what we call a GAL or CASA, which is a guardian ad litem, or a child court-appointed special advocate, also known as a child advocate, who's a volunteer. And they help with some of the observation of the child, some of the legal documentation and things that are needed. And so within this, you have foster parents and you have foster youth, but you also have regular communication with multiple other pieces in most cases. And sometimes that can be, it's both important, but it also can be a little complex. Outside of this, what we really need is, we need appropriate training for foster parents as well as other frontline child welfare workers like caseworkers and CASAs in order to be able to manage the needs of this chaotic system or this complex system. We also need policies that provide appropriate resources, appropriate timelines that are responsive to the needs of foster families. And we also need other types of supports in place, such as community resources and things like that. So when we think about what foster parents and foster youth needs, it's often really embedded in all of these other pieces. So lots to think about. It's not just about, how do people get along, but it's also about, do we really know how foster families are doing within this kind of constantly moving, constantly changing environment? And also, do they have the resources they need? For my research, and just to kind of give a little bit of information about what specific things you might find in my papers, if you were to dig a little deeper. So I'm really interested in kind of these interactions between risk and protective factors. So factors that might influence youth or foster parents for better outcomes or for worse outcomes, and how we can really understand how to promote better mental, physical, or relational health. So risk factors could be the influence of early adversity, problematic child behaviors, parent stress, stress with the foster care system, things that are protective for foster parents and also for youth too, are having resilience, having knowledge and skills, physical resources, social support and relationships. And then again, we hope that using our understanding or incorporation of protective factors, we can see better outcomes, because as we know, foster youth and foster families can face some significant risks in some cases. So it's important to understand both the system of the foster care system and the context that it provides, but also the experiences, attitudes, values, and needs of both foster parents and youth too. All right, so quick blurb. It's really difficult to get data on children and youth involved in the system and foster parents sometimes, because as you can imagine, you really want to protect them. They're going through a lot of different experiences, especially biological parents and families. They're going through, a lot of different services in order to try to work to get their family reunified. But there are secondary data sets, so government data or other types of data collection efforts where you can request access to this information for research. And then a lot of my research has been through internet and paper surveys or face-to-face phone interviews with foster parents who can report directly on their experiences. All right, so let's get into the meat of it. So foster parenting and family life. It's really important to understand that foster care is intended to be short-term. So the Adoption and Safe Families Act presents some timelines for how state government should go about trying to limit the amount of time that youth spend in care. This means that essentially most of the case plan goals for foster youth are to always reunify with the parents or the biological family when possible. However, that isn't always possible. But when you can, you should and need to be returned to their families. Youth have what we call attachment to their biological parent, to their biological families, and the importance of preserving their identity with that family. It could be their cultural identity, it could be their racial or ethnic identity, it could be their only family traditions, but it's really important that we do what we can to keep children out of care for long periods of time when possible, and also to return them to their families. The other thing to consider is that youth deal with multiple types of stressors and trauma, and this really does have an impact on family life. Within this, youth aren't just dealing from potential trauma of maybe abuse or neglect, but they're also dealing with the trauma of being put into foster care. A lot of people don't think about it, but just removal from your family is trauma in itself. So the position that youth are in the foster care system is a trauma. Additional trauma can come after that if youth are experiencing uncomfortable situations where they're not adapting well with the foster family, they're not getting services they need for mental health in a timely fashion, or if there's just other things that are going on for them that are difficult during that time, such as slow cases where they're not getting that visitation or that reunification with their family. And I want to point out the majority of youth are actually removed due to neglect. Neglect is family poverty, for example. It might be the effects of parental substance use, insufficient income of the family to meet the needs of children. So those kind of things are really what we need better social policies to address. It's difficult to think that the majority of youth are removed because families don't always have access to what they need when they're in a very difficult time in life. And abuse really does constitute a very limited number of cases of youth in the foster care system. The other thing to think about is not all youth, so I'm painting a complex picture, right? I'm painting a chaotic picture, but not all youth or families struggle the same. The majority of youth do recover from trauma. And within that number, I gave that number of 430,000 plus children. A lot of those children do recover. A lot of them are reunified with their family, or they make, connections with their family. But it is really important to consider that, they're in a very difficult point, and we need to have an understanding of all of the different pieces and stressors when we're understanding how to give the best help or services. The children who are most at risk for mental health problems generally need more care and support. And a lot of people kind of know this, but might not think about this is, mental health problems in children look like poorer behaviors. We often call them internalizing behavior or externalizing behavior. So acting out, or, kind of withdrawing and not being able to kind of talk or address an issue. And these kind of behaviors are really difficult for foster families. And those, like I said, those children who really have those mental health needs are needing more support and resources. The other side of this, though, is that not all youth need therapy. I hear a lot from, other people, well, we just need to make sure that everybody has therapy and it'll be okay. But it's not always about therapy. There's ways to help parents to have better tools so that they can incorporate parenting skills and help support youth mental health needs. And so, again, I always say not all youth need therapy. Sometimes we just need better in-home skills too. When we're thinking about family life from that of the foster parent, surprisingly, you might not believe this, but there's actually limited research that's really focused on newer foster parents. One reason for this is that newer foster parents tend to end their service sooner. We find that about a few research studies have found about 20% of foster parents do about 80% of the fostering. It's those veteran foster parents who have really figured out what works, who really have that personal mission, who are very connected to the foster care system, who do the majority of fostering. So we see people come in for a short period of time and then often exit sooner. Within that, we also see relative foster parents end service a little sooner. It might be related to preparation, but it's often also related that, if they're family, they have other resources for trying to help get that youth into a more stable place so that they don't have to be involved with the system as much, and relative foster parents might not be interested in or able to help other families out after that service ends. What we do know is that foster parents are generally motivated because of altruism or service, because of their child-centeredness, because of their faith or their family goals. And even though these things are really helpful and really important for creating a stable and loving environment for children, they often, as you can imagine, need more skills or more support. So it's really important to think that, we really need to know a little bit more about newer foster parents, but we also really need to look at newer foster parents as being in kind of this special time where they might need even greater support or help. So, and I have some of my studies cited in here along with other people's research, but I kind of pointed out when it's something that, that I've worked on. Most commonly used pre-service training, so the training that foster parents get before they have a youth come into their home, before they get involved in the foster care system, actually do not teach behavioral parenting skills. They're what we call didactic training over skill-based training, and so they provide a lot of background information. They might give you a list of bulleted tips. They might talk about like what strategies work, but they're not there to help foster parents practice how to work with youth who are dealing with mental health issues. They might talk about some case scenarios, but they don't often go over like specific situations where the foster parent would have that happen in their home and what to do, and kind of going over that, with them multiple times. So that pre-service training period is actually something that we really need to delve into just a little bit more. Also, we have found that there's really insufficient access to evidence-based training. So behavioral skills training is evidence-based training as compared to some of these didactic trainings. And even foster parents who have been fostering for a while can have trouble finding or knowing what that evidence-based training looks like. The reason that I point out this skill-based training too is because foster parent skills and youth mental health are related to better placement stability. And so what this means is that foster parents with higher skills are not asking for the youth to be removed because they're not having trouble managing the youth's behavior or mental health needs or other types of needs, but also that when youth have better mental health, they're more able to stay in their placement. Youth with more externalizing behaviors especially, so those acting out behaviors, things like aggression or fighting or yelling, those kind of things, those youth are more likely to be removed from their placement, whether because of the foster parent being asked or because the foster care system might not think that the foster parent can handle it. So improving skill for foster parents could also improve youth mental health, but also help stabilize that youth. And that removal from the foster home is another example of trauma for youth. A lot of times that's really difficult, even though you might think, well, why would they act out if they wanted to be there? Well, they don't have control of those behaviors when they're dealing with trauma or they're dealing with stress or they're dealing with mental health issues. And there's also, we've seen some research too that those moves for foster parents can be really hard. So when they have to ask or when the system removes a child, it can be really difficult for the foster parent as well. All right, so one early study that I did, we asked about foster parents' confidence in their pre-service training, and essentially a lot of them rated themselves as very high. So they think that they're confident and they're capable based on their pre-service training to tackle the needs of fostering. But this was a mixed method study, so we asked them to rate their confidence, and then we asked them open-ended questions to talk about what their strengths or their needs are. And a lot of foster parents said, I feel good, but I need more. So they need more training after the child comes into their home. They asked for specific types of training related to a topic area. They talked about specific behaviors that they really had difficulty handling. They talked about medical needs, for example, of some of the youth that came into their home that they didn't know about. And so despite this competence or ability, foster parents really do need more training after the child comes into their home. It's not just about pre-service, although we could do better, but it's also about doing more once the child is in the home. Managing the needs of the foster child, the marriage or family, the demands of the foster care system can feel really chaotic. This is a qualitative study that we did. And we've also seen that child behavior is particularly challenging for many foster parents. And that was another separate study. And essentially what this means is that there's a lot of different things to build. I talked about some of those protective factors, but also building resilience is key. Building the foster parent and the youth's ability to bounce back from these stressors and to be able to manage maybe the ongoing uncertainty or chaos that can sometimes be present within the foster care system is really important. So I'm going to talk more now about some of these strategies for building resilience and love. And I bring in love because I'm going to give some different ways to tackle this, and we're going to end with the relational side. So as I kind of hinted at this, and these strategies are based off of some of the projects that I've done or that are in progress right now, we really need to focus on improving pre-service training and preparation for new foster parents. What this means essentially, well, just to give you an example, one of the first studies we did, we found only 11 research articles that actually addressed pre-service training in the literature, talking about any aspects of its quality. However, when we compare an in-progress study that I'm working on, we found way more than 100 studies on different types of training, and some of them are evidence-based trainings. So there's a huge disparity between 100 studies and 150 something studies. And so we really need to start building on that. And we also have, a lot of the tools that we need to do this. And what the research is saying that foster parents really do need behavioral skills for working with children. They do need positive discipline strategies. Another study that we looked at found that foster parents, this one's not published yet, but foster parents who have more attitudes of support for things like corporal or physical punishment like spanking tended to experience more stress as a foster parent. We haven't delved into why that is, but it was just something interesting to think that, having behavioral skills, having positive discipline might be something you need when you're working with a youth who might need more positive discipline and less physical discipline. The other thing too, we're seeing that trainings really need to recognize and address values, beliefs, and attitudes towards youth and biological families. The primary goal of the child welfare system is to keep youth safe, but also to preserve and support families. You know, the goal is to reunify families. There's a lot of states that don't even use the language of foster parents very much anymore. They use the term resource families. And there's greater expectation that foster parents are going to be willing to work with biological families and support them even while the youth is in the foster home, so that that youth will be able to transition into the biological home a little bit more smoothly at the end of the placement. So improving pre-service training and preparation is key. Another aspect is co-parenting. This kind of comes from my family science background. Co-parenting is the ability to work with the other parent, and you can see that I have a list of different kinds of parents in here, but it's being able to manage your relationship with the parent, other parent or partner, and the child. It's being able to support the child's relationship with the other partner. It's being able to handle the challenges that often come up when you're parenting a child, and essentially learning to do that together. One of the studies, we found that there are foster parents who, well, most of the foster parents talked about struggling when the youth first came into their home. Because, you know, they had maybe a child before. Some of them had never had their own biological children, which happens a good bit of the time. But when you have a child with different types of challenges, or you're working with the foster care system for the first time, and you're dealing with these new expectations from the foster care system to report certain things, or to support a youth who might have behavioral needs, that they didn't have, you know, necessarily the tools to work together. So there's ways to support co-parenting between foster couples, but there's also ways of thinking that co-parenting happens between foster parents and biological families. It happens between foster parents and the child welfare system. The foster parent is the 24/7 in the home parent, you know, but the people who actually make most of the decisions for youth are the court system and judges, you know, who decide whether that child is reunified or not. And then the person who's reporting on what's going on in the foster home, which is usually the child welfare workers or the guardian ad litems or court-appointed special advocates. So essentially, our study was mostly on foster couples, but it really highlights the need to be able to help foster parents understand how to work with these other pieces and partners and kind of parents that are inherently involved in the foster care system as well. Another piece of this, and kind of getting into some of the relationships, is foster parents really need opportunities to get resources and social support. So what this means is assessing and providing them with ongoing opportunities. It can get really busy really fast. If you're a parent, you know, it gets really, when you have a child in your home, especially when the school year is going, especially, I won't even mention the impact of coronavirus this year, you know, things get really busy, and it's really difficult sometimes to know when or where to go for help. But because of the situation that foster parents have working within the foster care system, they might need both formal or informal supports. So formal supports are, you know, positive working relationships with caseworkers, the people who report on, who come in for regular visits with the foster family, but then they also need more informal connections to other foster parents, or what we often call veteran foster parents who've been around for a longer amount of time. It's a special context. I always, you know, think of the example of if you've been through a cancer diagnosis, if you've been through a divorce, you know, sometimes the best people to go through are those who have been through that too. And so same thing for foster parents. Sometimes the best thing for them is to really go through other people who have had similar experiences. And sometimes that means that they need to go through the caseworker for certain issues, but a lot of times it's connecting them to that support through people who are doing the same thing that they do. So lastly, when we're thinking about this resilience and love, we really want to think about supporting relationships between foster parents and youth in the home. Using secondary data, what we've found is that having better relationships between foster parents and youth is related to fewer problematic youth behaviors, and it often, in some ways, can negate some of the negative effects of trauma that youth have faced. And this is really important. Just because you're a parent doesn't mean that you automatically know how to connect with your child. Just because you've raised children from 0 to 18 and beyond doesn't mean that you know how to connect with youth of every age. And imagine having a youth come into your home that you've never met, who might have a different background or culture or religion or whatever experience than you, and it can be really difficult. And it's also important, one thing that we found through some of these studies, and I've seen some come out through other colleagues, is that foster parents and youth can have really different views or understanding of what problem behavior is. So most behaviors for youth come because they've been through some really difficult things. They're related to trauma, they're related to behaviors they've learned because they've had to do some things to survive on their own without as much support. They're behaviors that they've had to do in order to protect themselves from, emotional harm or physical harm. And so, that can be really hard. I think, if you think as a parent, you want your children to be, their best, to behave the best, and for foster parent, often they take responsibility for those behaviors, but, these youth come in and they're dealing with these behaviors and their trauma, and foster parents, they don't always know how to handle that. And so it's hard to know, where does responsibility lie? How do I handle this? And so foster parents will often see behaviors as worse or more negative, and youth might actually see them as more, it's just kind of a response in some ways, or maybe even more of an adaptation. And so sometimes with some of our research, we found that youth, they might report better relationships and fewer behaviors than their foster parents. Their foster parents might see things as more negative. So it's really important to understand that relationship is really important, and that relationship to youth is really important. However, sometimes we can also have different ideas of what that is. And so that means that we really need to support foster parents to build positive relationships, be resilient when the youth in their home are going through difficult behaviors or trauma or different experiences, and that those things can be really helpful in reducing future problematic behaviors for youth or reducing the impacts of trauma. All right, so that ends the main part. I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of my ongoing projects, just as we start to close up and open up for questions. And so one of the papers that we're currently working on right now, we're looking at foster parent personality and how they cope, and how those things are related to their parenting, and ultimately whether those things are associated with improved child behaviors. If that foster parent has a way that they handle or tackle problems, does it influence how they parent, and then does it influence the child's mental health when they have a parent who copes in different ways? One of the studies that we're looking at is looking more at co-parenting and what specific co-parenting behaviors are related to improved child behavior specific to foster children. You may not know, I know this because recently we found out there's only about 3 studies on foster parent co-parenting, or 4 studies I think now, on foster parent co-parenting in the literature that looks at foster parents as a couple. And so I think that this is a way that, we can really understand how to build more interest and more support for what goes on in the foster home as well. I'm also working with a few researchers on looking at guardians ad litem. So in Florida, those are volunteer child advocates, and that can be different things in different states. In other states, they're often called CASAs, and looking at their experiences and relationships with children and how really they can produce better equity for youth that are in care, and how we can use them as a lever for reducing inequality. And then lastly, I work a lot with what we call the National Survey of Child and Adolescent Wellbeing. It's a secondary data set. It's a private protected data set, but they collect a lot of data that is helpful for understanding relationships. And so we use that for a few different reasons, but you can look at relationships. You can also look at foster youth behaviors and their interactions with other child welfare workers as well. So these are the current and ongoing projects. In closing, I just want to thank you so much for your time today. I have a little diagram here just to imagine, I always think that the youth comes from a family. That family is deeply involved in the child welfare system, and the child welfare system is often influenced by the legal system. And so, you really can't look at just one piece of the system and not think about how youth are impacted by what happens in court, what happens behind the scenes in terms of getting services or making sure that the family has access to what they need. It's also not just about what happens in the home, but it really is understanding the whole system and kind of this complexity that helps us understand how to be more resilient and more loving when we're dealing with some of these challenges. But please let me know if you have any questions. I have my contact information up if you would prefer to contact me after. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. Again, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button in the bottom of your screen and type it. We're going to go through as many as we can in the remaining time. Morgan, you mentioned that about half of the children that are being put in foster care are being reunited with their families, and about a quarter are adopted. Are there any long-term studies on following these children? Is there any difference on how they progress through life in terms of maybe substance use, finding a job, those kind of pointers?
So most of the research that does follow youth longer term, I have not. So what I'm most familiar with is that they follow youth who aged out of foster care pretty frequently, because if a youth ages out of care, so they're not reunified, they're not adopted, they often rely on things like public supports or monies that are specific to help them to launch into adulthood. And so a lot of times we can track them for a little bit longer because they're tied into some of these supports. But we also have a pretty good and developing body of research, for example, on adoption and kind of the impact of adoption on youth outcomes. And usually what we see, but we don't have as much information on youth who were in care at some point but were reunified, for example. That's a population that's been harder to follow. But we do find among those specifically who are aging out, because they don't have the support of a parent or guardian, or they don't have a long-term connection to a family, as much as youth who are reunified or who are adopted, for example. They often do have more struggles. A lot of them recover, but they really hit some difficult terrain or some difficult territory for a little while, but they do struggle more with substance use, employment, academic outcomes, pregnancy, early pregnancy, and those kind of things.
For those that are reunited, I was actually surprised that such a large number of children are being reunited with their families, given that you pointed us out as the main cause for putting children into foster care is neglect, and maybe caused by family poverty or substance use. Those are not items that can easily be rectified in a short period of time, right? So I was surprised that actually 50% of the children are being, or about half, are being reunited with their families. Are they not being put into the same situation then again?
There is a small subset of people who experience what we might call like a recurrence of abuse or neglect. But a lot of families successfully navigate that. I would say there's always like a small subset of people who are, the most at risk and often remain at risk. But a lot of people, they're able to use that experience. They're able to seek out resources. They're given resources they really should have had before they entered foster care. And I always tell people, people shouldn't come into foster care many times. I mean, there's very few families that really should be in foster care. They really, really should get help before things get that bad, or they should have emergency supports in place. So, a lot of times foster care is what happens when we see, people having really big family emergencies, when they're cut off from family support, when they're cut off from financial supports. And so I always say my research is very much connected, I think, to a lot of larger social problems that, I would love to see addressed. But it is really interesting, that when I think it's really positive that when you give families what they need, they recover and they're resilient. But then you're always going to have a subset of families who are struggling more, where, they just have more risks to address than others, and that can make it difficult for them to bounce back.
Now we're in the time of a pandemic right now, an ongoing pandemic. Have you seen any trends where more children are being removed from the homes due to family stress resulting from COVID?
That's a good question, and something that I've actually seen there's different like news services, but we have like a daily news report for a child welfare, and they're finding that reports of maltreatment, so things like abuse and neglect, are very they're reduced right now, so that there's lower reports of maltreatment going on. Some suppose that it's because children are not around mandatory reporters. Some also assume maybe that it's more positive, that children are having more time with their families and they're like having time where they can, be healthier and engage and things like that. So it's a difficult thing, but they're trying to estimate that there will be, once the pandemic is over and once children go back, there might be a small surge in things like reporting and the need for foster care. However, there's a lot of uncertainty around that, and a lot of smart people who do different types of research saying, well, yes, but it could be this, or yes, but it could be this. So we'll have to find out whether reduced reporting will also be related to increased need for foster care, or whether maybe there has been a silver lining for some families and that they've been able to, be together more and handle things. But overall, I think the pandemic has been really scary and negative for a lot of people. And I think it's required a really high level of resilience from a lot of families.
Yeah, it's all new to us, and at least to our generation. Related to that, what has been the biggest challenge for placement of children during the pandemic?
So what I have seen come out of this mostly, and just from like news reports and hearing from people who are working on county level, is that arranging visits. So when children are not in the care of their biological family, they're supposed to have visits, and those visits are documented in what we call a case plan. So the plan for how the parents and children are working together to reunify. And so with the pandemic, there's been limitations on children being able to see their parents. They've been having to do more visiting via online. As you can imagine, being in the child welfare system, I just talked a little bit about some of the chaos and uncertainty. While not all caseworkers are technical specialists with computer knowledge and things like that. And so it's definitely put a strain on some of the resources of communities to figure out, how do we do visitation? How do we make virtual visitation something that's helpful for children? But it has been really difficult from what I've seen for children to try to engage in those visits with their families, while there's also limitations on, being able to travel to maybe a different county, for example, to see a family member or parent. So it's been a challenge.
So regardless of what the problem in their own family was, the foster children regularly visit their biological family. Do the foster family come with them? How is that arranged?
There's different situations, and I would say that depending on maybe the reason for that child being removed, that might influence the level of supervision of a visit. A lot of children can see their families without having anybody present. They might even get to spend the night, for example, as they're working closer to reunification. But then, depending on if there was maybe more of a situation of physical abuse or severe abuse, something along those lines that would be, may take a little bit longer to figure out how to rectify. There might be a higher level of supervision between a parent and a child.
Yeah. Okay, what is the typical vetting process of a family before they can foster?
So it's extensive, as you can imagine. You turn over I always say, if you've ever applied for a condo somewhere, you turn over your bank account. I don't know if your bank account, but you turn over a lot of information. I always joke it's like signing over a significant portion of your life, but you're asking them to come into your home. You're verifying that you have the income you need. You're verifying that you have resources and supports to manage stressful things that might come up with the child. You're verifying that you're willing to follow safety rules that you maybe never had to follow before. Locking up, certain substances, making sure you have fire extinguishers in certain places. So it's a significant process, and it's not just about the physical state of your home or whether you're physically ready or financially ready. You go through, in most states it ranges, but in Florida, I think it's somewhere around 30-ish hours of training before that child comes into your home. So it's a significant process, and it's, I mentioned that it's really difficult when youth are, removed from a placement, either by the foster parent's request or by the system thinking that maybe that's not the right setting. So it's really important that you have that process in place, but it is a big commitment.
Okay, you mentioned children in foster care have often survived a lifetime of uncertainty and change. For these children, do you think changes like social distancing and what we're currently in could trigger traumatic memories or symptoms? And if so, do you have suggestions on how to help them through this difficult time?
Yeah, so to be honest, with the social distancing, there's not a huge amount of research out yet. I can tell you just through the professional networks, there's a lot of calls for research, and it's really difficult, if you can imagine. So you have, it's a difficult process to do research, and you want to be really careful. So one, you have a child who's, in this kind of unique and maybe even vulnerable situation. where they're outside the care of their family and you're looking at how they're doing, but then you add on a layer of potential challenge for them with social distancing. And so asking, for information from the child can be difficult. A lot of times what you'll do is have the foster parent report on behaviors or report on their perceptions of the child, but they're doing that research. Some of it's coming out, but it's not quite out yet. So maybe if you are interested, you can email me and I can continue to keep you updated in a couple weeks. But for the most part, I'm sure there will be an impact, but we're still kind of working or waiting to see what that will be. In general, social distancing, I think, has had different impacts for different youth, depending on what resources they have, depending on their connections, depending on the communities they live in. But it has been difficult, and I know that a lot of researchers are expecting that there will be a longer term impact of how this situation really does impact children and youth, just because they're not able to talk about it with the people that they normally talk to about it every day. Families might not know how to talk about uncertainty. Sometimes I found that parents are uncomfortable having difficult conversations around anxiety or mental health. And so all of those things can make it difficult. So strategies, when possible and when able, talk about it. I think that just being really open and honest, not judging children for the feelings that they're having. They might have extreme feelings, but those are their feelings and it's a really real situation for them. I know a lot of adults who have been greatly impacted by what's going on. So children have a greater level. I would say children have way less control than adults do. And that's kind of why I do research on foster parents a little bit more than youth, is because they have more control over what's going on in the home. Right. But for the most part, just being really open, allowing that, responding in a non-judgmental way.
Right, and these children may also not have the network that we as adults may have to deal with something like the pandemic right now, right? What made you decide to study foster parents and kids?
Well, I always joke that a lot of times you'll hear social workers come in, they're like, I'll never work with that population. And I think this is probably, child welfare was one of those. I'm like, I'll never do that. I'll never work in mental health or whatever. And I ended up just getting, one of my internships was with mental health when I was a social work student. One of my first policy internships was with the governor's office. Like I said, that was something that I sought out, but it was something I was more unsure about and just kind of fell in love. I realized at the governor's office, so I helped edit policy. I took citizen calls from people who were doing foster care. And because of that, just recognizing the need for support, but also how much policy influenced the lives of families. And that's kind of how I got into it, is just that a lot of policies are created with the best intentions, but they do not understand kind of what the daily context of being a foster parent can be like. And so I would say I was a clinician, before I became a researcher. And I think that that's been something that's been really important. It's just recognizing something you're really interested in, kind of following that need.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think you mentioned that it is recommended to reunify the child with their biological family as opposed to with the fosters. The question that our attendee has, if a child has the opportunity to return home, would you recommend that compared to staying with a foster family? And is there any research that proves that the biological family is more effective to a child's mind than a foster family or any other environment, I guess?
Yeah, so this is really difficult. And I know that, I've kind of not glossed over, but I haven't been able to kind of dig into a lot of issues. There's a lot of fear that biological families are sometimes dangerous, or that, they are not going to be able to provide a safe environment. But I always say that a lot of families, as somebody who's a child welfare therapist, before, a lot of these families have unique stressors. They have things that are going on in their home that, create situations where you don't want to see that, and you don't want that for your child, but these are parents who deeply care about their child. And these parents that are involved in the child welfare system would never go through the services, never go through the case plan, or never even start the process if they didn't love and care deeply for that child. Like I said, that's why, thankfully, about half of them are able to kind of work through that. The foster care system also presents a lot of hoops for those parents to jump through. They might be getting family counseling, they might be getting individual counseling, they might be getting substance use counseling, they might be required to get a stable home in 3 months, which also means sometimes having a stable job when they've been working shift, work, or maybe they've been working multiple temporary jobs. And so those demands too, like often make it even more stressful for a parent. So there's a lot of things that people don't often realize kind of create a difficult context. However, there's something about, that being your mom, or your dad, or, maybe you're raised by a family member or somebody else, like that's your family, you became attached to them. And so, I always think that, every family, like that's their unique, that's their bond, that's their blood, it's their culture, it's their tradition. And, everybody has different values, but we do find that children really do better when they're returned home. They really do love that parent, even when maybe that parent caused a stressful situation for them or might have hurt them in the past. And that, children are very resilient as well, and children can grow and thrive when their family is able to, rebuild, when their family is able to bounce back from these things. So when possible, that should be there. Are there situations where youth might rather be with a foster family or rather be adopted? Yeah, those are definitely out there. And that's also the court-appointed special advocates or guardian ad litems. Those, the child advocate role is actually there to help to assess the best interests of the child. And that best interest is by figuring out what does the child want emotionally, mentally, relationally, but also considering other factors like safety or resources or supports. And so they present what we hope to be a more objective opinion of what that child, what would be in the child's best interest. So there's a lot of pieces that go into deciding what happens to children, and there's a lot of people involved, and sometimes that's for a reason, and it's difficult to manage those relationships, and a lot of people do have different opinions. But yes, that relationship with the biological family is extremely important.
You mentioned the guardians ad litem a few times now. What is that group of individuals, and how do you become a guardian ad litem?
So each judicial circuit in Florida has, and it's a little bit different for every state, so I don't know who exactly I'm talking to, but each judicial district in Florida has their own guardian ad litem, and usually you can just look up guardian ad litem or CASA, so GAL or CASA in the area that you live in. You'll go through a pretty extensive training. I think it's almost as much training as you would get to be a foster parent. But you take on a placement or two. So for you, you get a child that you're assigned to and you meet with them, however many times it's specified per month. Usually I think it's 2, but it probably differs in different places or different children. And you talk to them, you talk to their foster parent, and you write a report that is essentially submitted to the court system for the judge to consider. There's multiple people that report. So you have, I see we have a guardian ad litem case manager. Sometimes my buttons pop up there, but so you essentially have the caseworker who's reporting on the child, and you have a guardian, and you have you might have services being provided by other professionals like therapists come in, and all of those things are considered by judges in terms of whether the child's reunified, whether they get additional services, or whether they move towards adoption.
Interesting. The next question I actually wanted as well, why do the foster families in the pre-service training why does it not include behavioral parenting skills?
Yeah, so that is a really good question. I think, to be honest, the past, I would say 12 to 22 years, there's been a huge development in our understanding of behavioral parent training. So there's been a huge increase in the number of models that we know actually work for reducing behaviors for children. Most of these behavioral parenting interventions are tested on children who are not involved in the foster care system first. And so they started a long time ago. So let me preface that. So I'm talking just more about foster care research and building the evidence base for foster care training, but they've been around for a while, but it takes a long time to adapt something from one population to something that fits for another population. And I don't know why pre-service training hasn't been touched very much. That's something that I'm also working on. I have a grant that I'll be submitting soon, trying to work on that as well. But we do see that, we do see that a lot of the trainings try to address, are you even ready to be a foster parent? I mean, I think a lot of people, they're like, I love children. I help my family members out. I'm the person that my family members come to when somebody's in trouble. And that should be a really like a wonderful skill to have, but there's so much more that comes into stake or into play when, some of these parents want to adopt, but what happens when you have a child that you come in, that you bring into your home that you really want to adopt, but they're supposed to go home to their biological family, and the values that you hold might interfere with your ability to support that child being reunited with their biological family, for example. So a lot of times pre-service training has a lot of other things to tackle. It's not just the preparation, but like there's also, like I said, the values and the attitudes and belief systems that can kind of make that placement more difficult for you. And if you can imagine, a 30-hour training is a pretty expensive undertaking. It's a lot of staff time that child welfare agencies spend. And so we really want to, I think that a lot of the things that we currently address are things that could be taught or learned in a different way. And then we could really use that pre-service training to impart more valuable skills that will help the foster parent once they're in training. So there's a lot of complex pieces to that too, but that's the best answer I can give.
Okay, we're almost out of time. I'm going to end with one more question. For those of you whose questions were not answered, we will collect the questions and we'll have Dr. Cooley answer them offline and put them on our website together with a recording of the presentation. Okay, so the last question for today is, what if a child lives with their foster family, but the child is getting into a lot of trouble and the foster family just isn't helping that much, or for whatever reason can't help the child? What happens to the child? Is he or she going to get relocated to another foster family?
That's a good question. So generally in those cases, before a child is removed, the foster care system and the supervisors in that area are really going to consider what the impact of that removal will do to the child. You want to essentially the foster home to be a place where that child can grow and thrive. And so I think that there's going to be some things that you can address and some things that you can't address. The foster care system is mostly there to help reunite the family, provide the parents with the services necessary for that child to go home. And you don't want to send a child with high needs back into a situation where, everything is tentative. It's good. They've worked really hard to the parents have worked hard to, collect the financial or housing stability that they needed in order to show that they can have that child come home. But it can be really difficult. So sometimes the system will make the decision to remove the child. There are different types of foster care placement. So there's treatment foster care, which is essentially, it's a step above regular foster care. Foster parents in treatment homes, and it's a smaller group of people, do get specialized behavioral training to take the needs of children. They do have special supports from the foster care system in order to manage behaviors. So like more intensive behavioral supports, for example, from caseworkers when a child might be escalated or really having mental health issues that day that the foster parent can't handle. And then in some cases, the child will be removed to a residential or group facility where they do receive more intensive care, but they're not in like a typical family environment. The family environment, so if, a treatment home or a traditional or a relative home, it's always better for a youth. We see that youth in residential care often don't do as well as youth in family settings, but if that child can't be in a family setting without putting themselves or the family at risk, sometimes that removal would be necessary. So it's usually kind of how it's handled. And that child's behavior, depending on what's going on, could potentially threaten their ability to be reunified with parents. But the goal of the system is to keep the child safe and then support the family. And so that's always going to be the approach, is what's best for this child? What do we need to do to support the family? And then the foster family is a part of that too, if that's part of their ongoing placement. So sometimes they're removed, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're put into group care, sometimes they're in a treatment home. It depends on what the youth's need is.
Great. Thank you so much. And with that, we're out of time. Again, we will collect the remaining questions and have Dr. Cooley answer those offline. We will put those on our website together with a recording. With that, thank you very much, Dr. Cooley.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Bye, everybody.